Hello, welcome to the last lecture in the Peoples of the World course. We've covered a lot of ground this semester, and in this final lecture, I want to go back to some of the questions and problems we discussed in the first week about liberal education and the role of anthropology in your liberal education. To begin with, I want you to take out a piece of paper and some kind of a writing implement. It can be imaginary, digital, virtual paper, but I want you to write the answer to a question. The question is, if you could do one thing to change the world, what would it be? Take a couple of minutes, pause the lecture if you need some more time, but answer this. Use your imagination. What would you do if you could change the world? Okay, let's begin. The anthropologist George Marcus once described one of anthropology's strengths as being the discovery of the self through the detour of the other. From time to time, it's important to take time away from who we are and what we're doing to take a look at who we are and what we're doing, and why we're doing it. Marcus is saying that by studying others, we can learn a great deal about who we are and what we're doing. This is also sometimes called critical thinking. It's important to remember that critical thinking is not about criticizing someone or something. That's easy. Anybody can do that. The dumbest guy on the planet is just as capable of saying that sucks as the smartest woman on earth. Critical thinking involves being able to step outside your own little world and take a fresh perspective on things, and then use that fresh perspective to broaden and expand your little worlds. And we all live in little worlds. Worlds defined by our limited experiences. That's one of the things that culture does. It allows us to create little models of the world so we can handle the complexity of life and not become paralyzed by it, and manage it successfully. Culture is an adaptive resource in that way. Like every resource, it's both enabling and constraining. But in a globalizing world where we're all tumbled together by economic and social forces outside our individual control, it becomes essential that we expand our cultural repertoires, that we examine and rethink and expand our worldviews. How we see the world determines how we live our lives. How do you see the world? What's your worldview? There are almost 7 billion people on the planet now, and if I reduce that 7 billion to 100 people, to a percentage, 60 would live in Asia. 15 are from Africa. 12 live in Europe. 9 live in South America and the Caribbean. 5 live in North America. 50 would be women, and 50 would be men. 17 would not be able to read and write. One of these people is starving. 15 have so little food that they're malnourished. 21 are overweight. How was your lunch? 23 would have nowhere to live. And one of those people would control half of the world's wealth. Oh yes, and 7 of those 100 people would have been to college. The vast majority of the world's population is wealthy or poor, educated or uneducated, starving or obese, not because they made good or bad choices, or because of how hard or not they worked, but for the same reasons that they speak one language or another, dress as they do, and think as they do, because of the time and place in which they happen to be born. Whether you asked for it or not, you are part of a global elite, and as such, you have power. So what's your worldview? Is it realistic? Is it broad enough to see where you fit in the wider world? Or is it narrowly focused on your friends, your classes, and where you're going to go out Friday night? How we see the world determines how we live our lives. In my first lecture this semester, I asked you how you wanted your life to be different next year than it was this year. How do you want your life to be different when you graduate than it is today? Do you want to be happier, richer, smarter? Do you want to be in a stable relationship, a good job? What are you doing now? Here at Miami, to build that future? In this lecture, I want to pose these questions in a different way. Point A represents you right now, with all your flaws, your skills, your talents, your good habits, your bad habits, your motivations. Point B represents a future you. This is a different, better version of you. This is you at some physical, emotional, or intellectual peak. I don't know what that version of you looks like. Neither do you, probably, but you should. You should start getting a clear idea of who that person is so you can make that person happen. This arrow represents the path from A to B. Well, let's give it a name. Let's call the path from A to B a life trajectory. In my own work, I write quite a bit about people's life trajectories and about social futures, the way that people, individually and collectively, imagine those trajectories for themselves, for their children, and for their families. I draw a lot on the work of the social theorist Pierre Bourdieu, a philosopher turned anthropologist, turned sociologist, turned social theorist, who died just a few years ago. Bourdieu believed that behavior and belief, thought and action, were two sides of the same coin. He called this conjoining of beliefs and actions practice. He said that we learn culture in the form of practices, and as we learn them, and as they work for us in our limited life experience, they turn into habits. And habits can become so deeply ingrained that we confuse things that are cultural and particular with things that are natural and universal. We confuse our little worldviews with an authentic view of the world. We become ethnocentric. And that ethnocentricity shapes our life trajectories, and it limits us. One of our own little worlds is the world of the schools we attend. Just by having a college experience, you are in the global elite. Just by going to Miami, you're in the top half of that top 7% of the world's educated people. All over the world, people are struggling for an education. What are you doing with this extraordinary opportunity? When I say that we get from point A to point B by education, I do not mean by education going to school. I mean by education a set of practices by which you make yourself change by changing what you know and what you do with what you know. Schooling is an education. Going to school doesn't make you educated. Attending classes doesn't make you educated. No teacher and no institution can make you educated. School is full of skill-building tools, mentors, and advisors to create a powerful learning environment, but you have to educate yourself. People who excel in this world often tend to have three things in common: a commitment to lifelong learning, a capacity for critical thinking, and a desire to learn the best ways of getting things done. Whether you're a Buddhist monk or a corporate executive, one of the hallmarks of success is recognizing and embracing the fact that learning is a lifelong process. This is true at every level of the learning process that we described earlier when we learned about the acquisition of culture. Part of the reason that you are in a liberal arts education is to learn how to learn, so that you can be a lifelong learner. In the end, though, when you leave this class, it is not important if you remember the functions of drinking in Subanen, or how tattoos work as social markers, or any of the other specific examples of cultural practices that we have learned about. What's important is how the readings, lectures, and exercises performed in this class helped you to develop the ability to understand new information, to integrate it with things you already know, to come to a tentative conclusion about it, subject to new information, and express that conclusion orally and in writing. Whether you are a Papua New Guinea big man, or a Nuer leopard skin chief, or a rising executive in a multinational corporation, one thing a successful person is always doing is looking for the best practices within the broader social repertoire for solving particular kinds of problems, or creating more efficient ways of achieving culturally specified goals. So where does anthropology have anything to offer in helping us achieve our life trajectory, our social future that we imagine for ourselves? I want to suggest some basic takeaways from the anthropological perspective. First, relativism. Relativism is the position that all behaviors and ideas make sense when understood in their own context. A relativist perspective prompts the question, am I judging this? It takes as a rule of thumb that you should not make a decision about a cultural practice until you understand it well enough to be able to explain it to someone from that culture in a way that they will accept. Saying that anthropology is empirical emphasizes that anthropologists base their knowledge about other cultures primarily on observation and experience. The empirical perspective prompts the question, how can I learn what's actually going on here? And it takes as a rule of thumb that observation and first-person testimonies are to be privileged over hearsay and prior judgments. Anthropology assumes that culture is adaptive. That is, that cultures change in response to internal and external pressures. A key question to ask of an intercultural encounter you might have is, how did things get this way? And an appropriate rule of thumb is that even practices that are supposedly traditional serve real practical uses in the current social milieu. Cultures will always change in response to external pressures, but they don't always change in predictable ways. Arbitrary efforts to impose changes to fix problems that are produced by intercultural differences rarely work. Understanding, as a first step to change, always tends to be the better way. Comparison refers to the effort to find similarities that can help us get a handle on differences. The key question inspired by the comparative perspective is, what is this like in my culture, in my little world? Or, to put it another way, what is this like that I already know? The comparative perspective is based on a rule of thumb that there are usually underlying similarities that can help us understand the differences we encounter in the world. Holism is a way of looking at ideas and practices as interrelated elements within a wider cultural system. A holistic approach asks, to what other parts of the culture is the idea or practice I'm concerned with connected? It assumes that changes in any idea or practice will lead to changes in other ideas and practices. Holism is crucial, especially when trying to come to a solution to an intercultural problem that you encounter, because the cultural practice that poses the problem is often linked to many other cultural ideas and practices, creating a great deal of resistance to arbitrary change, no matter how logical those changes may appear to the outsiders suggesting them. Effective changes often need to be adaptive, incorporating elements of the two cultures into something new. Okay, that's the end of the first part of the lecture. In the second part, I want to tell you 3 stories about people who changed the world in big and little ways. And then I want to come back to your answer to the question that I posed at the beginning of the lecture. Thanks.